Why did they only notice the papers, and never the woman carrying them? Hallway was always loud. Boots slamming rhythm into the floor, radios whispering codes, doors opening, doors closing, orders being born and dying every few minutes. People moved fast, people moved loud. That was the base. It never truly slept, it just changed tempo. She walked through it like a shadow trained to survive daylight. Arms full of paperwork pressed tight to her chest, careful not to drop anything, careful not to disturb the rhythm, careful not to take up more space than she was allowed. Someone brushed past her, barely looking. Another bumped her shoulder and muttered something like sorry, but it sounded like annoyance wearing politeness as camouflage. Two young soldiers laughed under their breath. They thought they were subtle. They never were. Paperwork girl. Admin only. The little labels people create to feel taller. She didn't react. She never did. She adjusted her grip, tucked her chin, and kept walking. The hallway swallowed her the way it always did. She belonged to function, not attention. She took pride in that, or at least she told herself she did. For a moment, as she paused at a door, the light shifted. The bracelet at her wrist slipped against her skin. Something metallic flashed beneath it. Quick, sharp, deliberate. Something that did not belong to a life defined by printers and signatures and polite silence. Something that could have burned through their assumptions if they'd bothered to look. But no one did. No one ever did. They kept seeing the stack of papers, the quiet walk, the steady breathing, the harmless woman moving through important corridors as if she needed permission to exist inside them. They didn't notice the weight she chose to carry under fabric and habit. Not yet. Her name was Mara Dalton. She worked where maps lived, where routes weren't simply lines but lifelines, where wrong strokes didn't just create mistakes, they created casualties. On paper, she was logistics and operations coordination. In reality, she was the quiet force that made sure vehicles did not drive into chaos just because someone at a desk wanted to feel powerful. People knew her the way you know a chair that never breaks. Always there. Always useful. Easy to forget. She never demanded space, never demanded credit. She spoke softly. She finished tasks before most remembered assigning them. She made everything feel smoother than it actually was. And when life feels smooth, people assume it's easy. So they assumed she was easy. They didn't ask about the years before logistics. She never volunteered them. She didn't talk about the deployment. She didn't talk about the night that never left her. She didn't talk about bodies she couldn't save, or how silence after screams is its own kind of noise. She didn't talk about guilt that didn't shout, it just stayed. She avoided walls of medals and plaques like they were haunted places. She didn't trust ceremony. Ceremony was what people built when they wanted to believe pain had meaning. Her mother always told her to find something calmer. Her brother said he was proud, and then changed the subject. Most people praised what they understood. No one asked about what they didn't. Underneath her calm, storms never fully cleared. They just learned how to sit quietly. But some people noticed what others didn't. Commanders slid harder tasks across her desk. They didn't explain why. They didn't need to. She solved problems without making noise. That was her strength and her curse. She wore the same bracelet every day. Silver, unremarkable, almost a habit more than an accessory. Beneath it, something heavier rested against her skin. Sometimes it caught the light. Sometimes it remembered its story. Sometimes it threatened to make itself known. She always covered it again. Not because she was ashamed. Because memory deserves respect, and respect isn't always public. Then the alert sliced through the base. Silence died instantly. Phones lit up. Radios snapped awake. Boots changed tempo. Mara looked up from manifests as the operation screens bled red across the maps. A convoy was in contact. They were not where they should have been. Their route wrong. Their timing wrong. Their safety gone. The room filled in seconds. People talking fast. people wanting to sound in control. A newer officer, young, eager, painfully confident, took command. He waved off questions. He wanted to look decisive. He didn't realize decisiveness without clarity is just ego in uniform. Mara's eyes never left the map. The route on the screen wasn't hers. Somewhere between approval and execution, someone had overridden it. Static crawled across the radios. When sound punched through, it carried gunfire with it. Not distant, not casual, close enough that the room flinched. Mara stared at the valley shape on the screen. She knew it. Not this exact valley, but the kind. Narrow, curved, a natural mouth that swallowed vehicles and spat out regret. A place designed by nature to be misused by men. A kill zone. Pressure wrapped itself around her chest. Time started to thin. The room spun toward panic disguised as professionalism. Orders collided. Voices layered over each other. People blamed equipment, blamed weather, blamed anything that didn't have a face. Mara traced the route with a hand that didn't shake, because muscle memory sometimes carries you when courage has to catch up. She followed the precise point where the mistake was born. She didn't guess. She remembered. She remembered another night. Another valley. Another moment someone believed the map would bend to authority instead of reality. Her voice came out steady when she spoke. Too steady. It carried truth the room didn't want. The officer barely turned his head. Logistics. Paperwork. Stay in your lane. Someone laughed quietly. Someone smirked. And for just 1 second, she almost obeyed. Habit is powerful, but guilt is stronger. Her bracelet felt suddenly heavy. Like it remembered too. Like it didn't want silence anymore. She raised her voice, not loud, just undeniable. The route was wrong. The convoy was trapped. If they kept going, people wouldn't take casualties. People would die. Not numbers. Not statistics. People with families, with pictures taped inside their vehicles, with last messages sent too casually because no one expected last to matter. Her hands moved. Satellite logs. Archive sweeps. Elevation overlays. Reality. Not podium confidence. While others tried to control fear, she mapped it. But rank pushes back when truth threatens pride. Her warning was filtered, diluted, declawed. Dismissed. Paperwork girl was worrying about hills. The room split without announcing it. Those who believed authority creates safety, and those who knew safety doesn't care about rank. The radios got uglier. The valley tightened. New sounds entered the speakers. Sounds the room didn't want to hear. Mara sat down at a terminal no one was using. Not permission. Instinct. She bypassed standard routing, opened channels she shouldn't have still had access to. The door slammed open. A colonel entered like gravity. The young officer straightened fast and defended himself faster. Excuses poured out wearing intelligence as costume. Mara spoke through him like fog through light. Terrain funnel. Kill zone. Alternate route. Now. The room paused. Laughed. Uncertain. Uncomfortable. Her bracelet slid down her wrist. She tugged it off without thinking. It hit the console with a sound that didn't belong to office life. Metal. Military. Memory. Someone near the back inhaled sharply. Whisper. Recognition. Reality correcting itself. The colonel's eyes dropped to her wrist. Then to her face. He didn't see paperwork. He saw the past she never spoke about. He asked one quiet question. Where did you learn this? Her answer wasn't a story. It was wounds rearranged into data. It was memory converted into math. It was pain turned into something useful for once. The colonel listened. Really listened. Outside, people were fighting for their lives. Inside, a decision was forming. A heavy one. A necessary one. And somewhere underneath fear, guilt, and duty, something else flickered inside Mara. Not pride. Not power. Just a calm she hadn't felt in years. The kind that arrives when the worst thing you ever lived through, finally, finds a purpose. A different kind of silence filled the room. Respect. Unspoken. Unforced. And finally, the order changed. The room moved. Time, which had been trying to kill them, shifted its weight. And the story stopped being about a woman carrying papers and started being about the woman who refused to let a valley write another obituary. What if the moment everyone feared was already happening, and no one wanted to say it out loud? The reroute command had left the room. It was somewhere in the air now, carried in fragments of breath and electricity. People stared at screens like superstition might help. If they watched hard enough, maybe the icons would behave. Maybe fear would blink softer. Maybe this would turn into one of those near-miss stories people tell later with nervous laughter, turning terror into entertainment. Mara didn't believe in maybe. She watched the convoy icon stutter, hesitate, then begin to pivot. It wasn't graceful. Convoys never are. They are heavy creatures, slow to understand danger, slower to escape it. One wrong wheel spin can decide whether someone lives or becomes a name carved into metal. Her fingers hovered over the console, steady but tense. She wasn't in control of them. She was simply holding the line between panic and precision. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Just noise. Just breath. Just waiting. Then the trap behind the convoy woke up. Detonations flashed along the abandoned route, ugly blooms of dust, echoes too late to matter but close enough to wound imaginations. The room went quiet in the worst way, not relieved, not safe, not proud. Just aware of how close they had come to losing people. Someone swore softly under their breath. Someone else closed their eyes and reopened them as if sight needed resetting. The colonel didn't move. Neither did Mara. She didn't have the luxury of reacting. She stayed where the danger still existed. Ahead, the terrain didn't care that they'd escaped the first set of teeth. It offered new shapes, new risks, new places where mistakes could turn into memorials. She followed every curve and ridge as if touching them might change them, as if sheer attention could keep people alive. It wasn't magic. It was responsibility. Radio voices came through fractured and raw. Fear lived inside them, not theatrical, not cinematic, just human fear trying to stay professional. The kind where people keep talking because silence might mean finality. Mara answered in a tone that didn't rise or fall. Distances. Angles. Timing. She called adjustments the way someone calls breaths. Do this. Now this, just a little more. Hold, move. You're not safe yet, keep going. There was no ego in it, no heroics. Just stubbornness against fate. Twice the convoy brushed past hidden positions, so close she could almost imagine the ambushers looking up in confusion, realizing the prey was no longer standing where they had rehearsed their triumph. Gunfire crackled behind, late and useless. But victory doesn't feel like victory when survival still feels fragile. One vehicle lagged. Of course it did. There is always one. A warning light. A sick engine tone. A driver pushing a machine that wasn't sure it wanted to survive tonight. The road ahead bent toward a shallow basin, a place nature sculpted to look harmless from the wrong angle, a place experienced eyes knew better than to trust. Myra saw it coming. But seeing isn't enough if speaking comes too late. Her breath caught. Instinct bit through hesitation faster than rank could interfere. Turn now. She didn't shout it. She placed it. Sharp, precise, unarguable. Seconds stretched. The map held its breath. The vehicle lurched, skidded, corrected, found stubborn speed again. A beat later, an explosion tore into the basin they'd escaped. Someone in the room whispered something that sounded like disbelief, praying not to become grief. Then the convoy climbed. Not triumphant, not victorious, just alive. Voices on the radios shifted, still shaking, still raw, but threaded with relief. Fragile, almost guilty relief, the kind that acknowledges survival is a gift that always feels borrowed. Mara didn't smile. She didn't sag. She didn't celebrate. Her body hadn't learned safety yet. Her brain still held the valley. Her memory still knew nights where radios went silent forever. The colonel finally inhaled like oxygen had weight again. He turned toward the young officer. The room didn't become dramatic. Nobody shouted. Real accountability rarely yells. It speaks in firm tones and leaves no room to sidestep truth. Questions were asked. Answers tried to hide. Reality did not let them. Responsibility traveled to the right shoulders. Then his gaze came back to Mara. He didn't thank her. He didn't perform respect. He simply acknowledged her. Plain, direct, undeniable. He looked at the metal on her wrist like seeing a language he finally understood. He asked, not as a superior demanding information, but as a human asking another human to trust him with the truth. And she told him, not with drama, not with pride, just facts laid out with the care of someone who has carried them too long to let them turn into stories. A mission, a night, a decision, staying when retreat would have been easier. Lives saved, lives lost, and the quiet aftermath that didn't fit inside any ceremony the world tried to wrap around it. Silence layered the room. Not empty silence. Respect, regret, recognition. Some people stood straighter. Some swallowed hard. Some remembered the moments they had laughed earlier and felt something heavy settle in their chest. Shame can be a teacher if you let it. The convoy survivors would live. That was the headline only hearts could read. Systems would write it as data. Reports would frame it with structure. Paper would flatten it into paragraphs and signatures. But for now, the room allowed itself to feel. Then came the aftermath. Not loud. Not cinematic. Just slow, procedural consequence. The report was built. Timelines reconstructed. Choices examined. The officer who had overridden her plan didn't disappear into punishment. That's not how real systems work when they're trying to grow instead of just hurt someone. He faced structured accountability. He lost command. He kept a career. A mark followed him. Lesson, not destruction. And on the same day, a protocol changed. Quietly, efficiently, powerfully. Logistics would no longer be treated like furniture in the room. They would sit inside the heartbeat of operations from now on. No more silent overrides. No more egos pretending terrain is optional. No more mistaking quiet professionals for background noise. The memo was short, dry, almost boring, which is how real change often looks. The base shifted in ways small enough most wouldn't notice, except the ones who depended on those small shifts to stay alive. And Mara, her world didn't explode into applause. She walked through days that felt almost the same, except for the weight in the air when people looked at her. Some came with awkward gratitude. Some offered nods heavy with something like apology. Some didn't speak at all because words felt too small. A few convoy survivors found her office. They didn't know how to say the things their hearts felt, so they said too little instead of too much. A hand held longer than expected. A thank you that sounded like survival trying not to cry. Then one who couldn't hold it in anymore broke down and apologized for taking her time. She told them it was fine. It was. But after they left, the relief inside her came tangled with something darker. Old ghosts stirred. Memory doesn't like to be reminded it once mattered and failed anyway. She wrote the report like she always did, clean, precise. Emotion turned into order so it couldn't hurt as much. That night she covered the metal again, beneath the bracelet. Not to hide. To keep it where it belonged. Close. Quiet. Hers. The bass returned to rhythm, but it wasn't the same rhythm. There was a new note in it now, respect woven into routine, recognition humming beneath movement. People didn't bump her aside anymore. They didn't talk over her voice and expect the world to agree. They didn't see paperwork first anymore. They saw weight. Earned weight. Carried without noise. One morning she walked the same hallway where laughter used to follow her like an echo that believed it was harmless. Papers in her hands. Footsteps in rhythm. Life still loud. But the air parted now, not because she demanded it, but because sometimes dignity changes rooms simply by remaining standing long enough. She didn't walk taller. Quiet strength rarely needs to. And yet, something inside her that had been tight for years loosened just slightly. Like a wound that would never fully heal had finally learned it didn't need to bleed every day. But peace is never permanent in places like this. Trouble never asks permission to return. And somewhere beyond calm schedules and repaired pride, a new storm was already forming. What happens when the person who saved everyone becomes the person the storm quietly leans toward next? No alarms, no dramatic music, just a quiet shift in the air that people with enough scars can feel without needing proof. Weeks passed after the Convoy incident, but peace on a base is never actually peace. It's just a softer tone between impacts. People laughed again. Meetings felt routine. Work returned to predictable chaos instead of desperation. Yet somewhere beneath it all, something was changing, not loudly, not obviously, like weather building far away. Mara didn't chase it. She didn't try to predict it. She simply kept working. Plans still needed to be drawn. Routes still needed to be shaped. Lives still needed someone stubborn enough to think ahead. People treated her differently now. It was subtle. A shift in posture when she entered a room. A pause before someone dismissed a concern. A silence that didn't feel empty anymore but attentive. She didn't enjoy it. She didn't resent it. She simply accepted it as the cost of truth finally being acknowledged. Respect once earned demands responsibility. She carried that quietly too. She sat in an evening operations review when the first small sign appeared, a data line that didn't feel wrong but didn't feel right either, just slightly off. A convoy scheduled for next month. A training exercise planned near the edge of territory that maps had never truly loved. On paper, it was standard. Routine. A logistical heartbeat the base didn't think twice about. But Mara didn't look at plans like paperwork. She looked at them like promises. And promises deserved fear. So she studied it the way she studied everything, quietly, without drama, as if the most dangerous thing in the world was overconfidence pretending to be calm. She traced the roads, then the gaps, then the pieces that weren't technically mistakes but felt like invitations. She didn't raise it immediately. She wanted proof before she interrupted the fragile trust people had finally learned around her. She worked into the night, screens glowing, pencils scratching softly against paper like breath. Memory sat beside her like it always did, not haunting, just present. The metal under her bracelet rested against her skin, not heavy, just there like a pulse. Outside, night carried itself with the ease of something that believed it had time. Inside, time was already moving faster. Morning arrived with tired eyes and lukewarm coffee. The room filled again, this time without panic, without shouting, without urgency, which in some ways is more dangerous. Complacency feels like safety. Stability feels like truth. And numbers, when they behave, convince people the world is predictable. But danger rarely announces itself as danger. It comes as confidence, as routine, as we've done this before. The young officer who had lost his command wasn't in the room anymore. The new operations lead moved slower, thought more, listened better. The colonel carried himself with the quiet kind of authority that no longer needed to be proven. It should have felt safer. Part of Myra wanted to believe it was. But she found herself glancing back to the same route again and again. The same thin thread through unfriendly geography. The same timing that felt convenient instead of cautious. The same unspoken hope that reality would behave because they wanted it to. She didn't speak yet. She waited. Patterns reveal themselves to patience. Later that week, intelligence updates arrived. Not alarming, not explosive, just tiny adjustments to how risk was being measured. Tiny enough most people scanned past them. Tiny enough to be categorized as not immediately relevant. But to Mara, they felt like pressure applied to a bruise. So she asked a question. Not dramatic. Not confrontational. Just clear. Why this route? The room went still for half a breath. Not because she didn't have the right to ask now, but because people were finally learning to understand that when she asked a question, it wasn't noise. It was warning. A captain shrugged gently. Logistics efficiency, less travel time, lower fuel burn, good for schedule, good for morale. His tone wasn't arrogant, just logical, reasonable. The most dangerous tone in operations is often the reasonable one. It sounds responsible while accidentally negotiating with risk. Myra didn't argue. She didn't have enough yet. So she dug further. She requested satellite passes, pulled civilian geological surveys older than some of the soldiers in the building, cross-referenced seasonal erosion with historical weather patterns. She was building something delicate, a picture of the land refusing to cooperate with good intentions. Night after night. Quiet work. No applause. No audience. Just duty. But beneath her calm concentration, emotion lived. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just steady ache. Every time she saw a risky curve, she remembered the sound of radios drifting toward silence. Every time she plotted a safer option, she remembered people who never got one. Every time she moved a convoy icon on a theoretical map, she pictured real human hands on real steering wheels. The heartache didn't control her, but it fueled her. Eventually, she found what she feared she would. The road wasn't just inconvenient. It was unstable. Terrain shifts barely mapped. Blind rises. Hidden natural choke points disguised as harmless bends. Places where vehicles would slow because nature told them to. The same places threat would love. She brought it forward. The room didn't laugh this time. The room didn't dismiss. People leaned in. Screens zoomed. Risk acquired shape. The colonel listened. Deeply. He didn't praise her. He didn't dramatize the moment. He simply asked one thing. What's your alternative? Her breath held for a beat, not because she wasn't ready, but because every time someone trusted her judgment, responsibility tightened around her ribs a little more. If she was wrong now, it wouldn't just be a mistake. It would be betrayal. But fear wasn't going to lead. She laid out the alternate corridor. Not perfect. No route ever is, but safer in the ways that mattered. Less predictable to anyone watching from high ground. Less dependent on luck pretending to be planning. There was discussion. healthy disagreement, genuine hesitation. Because real leadership doesn't chase easy certainty. It sits with doubt long enough to respect it. Then the decision came. Not rushed, not forced, thoughtful. Her plan was adopted provisionally, reviewed, tested. And that should have been the end of it. Except storms don't care about approved plans either. 2 weeks later, the unexpected arrived. A sudden shift in field conditions. Moves on the board no intelligence brief had predicted. A ripple in the region that turned routine into risk without asking permission. The mission that was supposed to stay theoretical suddenly became immediate. Tension returned to the base. Not the screaming kind. The breathing kind of too shallow kind. People moved with focus again. Rooms filled with urgency again. Screens looked like living things again. And almost without anyone consciously deciding it. Everyone looked for her. Not to fix everything. Not to save the day. Just to ground it. She stood still for a moment when she noticed it. All those eyes, all that silent expectation, a strange warmth mixed with pressure inside her chest. Pride, fear, responsibility, memory. 3 emotions aren't supposed to coexist that close without tearing something. She managed it anyway. Not because she was invincible, but because she understood the weight of being trusted. She leaned into the map, into the terrain, into the stubborn belief that thinking deeply about people's safety is not weakness. It is strength disguised as caution. Voices rose. Data changed. Plans adapted. But beneath it all, Mara anchored the room. She didn't command. She didn't demand. She guided. And yet deep inside her, a quiet thought whispered, what if this time thinking isn't enough? What if this time preparation still loses? What if the world takes not because you did wrong, but because sometimes it just does? Hope pressed against fear. Determination wrapped itself around doubt like armor. And beneath the metal hidden under her bracelet, her pulse was steady. Because there was still something she hadn't told them. Not yet. Not because she was hiding, but because some truths only matter when the world is moments away from breaking. And it felt like they were moving closer to one of those moments. Every hour, every update, every fragile breath. What do you do when every precaution still feels like standing on thin ice, and every plan sounds like it's promising safety it can't guarantee? The room wasn't frantic like last time. That almost made it worse. Panic at least admits that danger exists. Calm tension is quieter, heavier. It means everyone understands risk and is choosing to move toward it anyway. Necessary risk. Calculated risk. The kind that leadership wears like armor and soldiers carry like fate. Mara stood at the map again. Not because she wanted to be here. Because she couldn't imagine not being. The mission window was tightening. Conditions shifting faster than forecasts like to admit. A weather system creeping along the edge of the region. Not enough to cancel anything, enough to complicate everything. A subtle enemy, the kind trucks and nerves hate equally. Convoy composition was different this time too. Medical support embedded. Supply elements mixed with tactical. Not just equipment at stake. People who existed to save others. That always changed the weight of every decision. She traced the chosen route with her eyes like she was memorizing it not as a path but as a responsibility. Every inch of terrain felt personal now. She had studied it too long for it to stay abstract. Elevation lines weren't just lines. They were breathing space, danger, opportunity, threat, hope. Her voice guided planning discussions with that strange stillness she carried. A steadying calm that came from fear not being allowed to lead, even though it still lived right under her ribs. They ran contingency drills. reviewed reroute options, rehearsed response layers. At one point, someone suggested simplifying, cutting safety margins in the name of speed. It wasn't reckless, just optimistic. The kind of optimism that loves efficiency and hates remembering how indifferent nature is to human urgency. Mara didn't argue loudly. She simply asked a question. And if the weather worsens sooner than projected, how will you pivot? Not if, when lived quietly behind the sentence. Silence stretched, not because people didn't know the answer, because they didn't like what answering required admitting. They rewrote the plan. Again. That was the thing about real leadership. It doesn't fall in love with its first idea. It remains willing to feel uncomfortable right up until it has to act. The colonel nodded once. No drama, no speeches, just a decision landing softly because certainty never quite arrived and responsibility had to move without it. Outside, engines eventually roared to life. Inside, something inside Mara coiled a little tighter. This wasn't like last time. That had been chaos crashing unexpectedly. This was walking toward danger knowingly, rationally, because sometimes the only wrong choice is refusing to move at all. Sometimes survival requires risk. That truth isn't comforting. She stood in the operations room as the convoy rolled out. Radios hummed. Position updates flickered. Screens turned motion into data, data into heartbeat. People moved with purpose, but every calculated step carried quiet hope inside it. For a while, everything behaved. Progress measured itself neatly. Weather edges pressed in but didn't fully bite. Terrain tested them without punishing them. Mara didn't relax. She never relaxed when lives were moving through uncertainty. She watched the weather front creeping, its edges chewing time away. The world outside didn't know it was holding breath, but she did. She listened to radio cadence like it was a living thing she could diagnose. Every pause, every breath, every sentence that carried just one extra fraction of strain. Hours passed. Then something shifted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just wrong. A tone in a voice. A hesitation. A change in the rhythm of updates. She leaned forward. Situation check. Minor slowdown ahead. Visibility beginning to dip. Wind rising. Road surface changing character in ways maps can't fully explain. Natural friction beginning to invite risk. The kind of situation leadership must constantly choose between underreacting to or overreacting to. She asked for clearer readings. Requested alternate angles. Asked for confirms without sounding panicked. The convoy continued. Carefully now. Measured. No longer moving through a plan. Now negotiating with reality. Terrain narrowed. Wind scraped across microphones. Weather thickened around them like the world had decided to test how much caution could hold. Someone in the room muttered something about projections being slightly off. Someone else mentioned visibility being manageable for now. The conversation tried to stay clinical, tried to remain mathematical. But human ears hear fear before numbers record it. The colonel's eyes moved to Mara. He didn't ask whether she was worried. He asked what she saw. Trust changes the shape of a room. It shifts power. It sharpens responsibility. It binds people together in ways rank alone never could. She breathed in slow, grounding herself not in fear but in clarity. She described the terrain honestly. The bends. The partial bottleneck. The place where unpredictability started stacking instead of scattering. No exaggeration. No false comfort. Truth. Then, because truth wasn't enough, she layered judgment. They could continue. They could pause. They could reroute partially. Every option carried risk. Every option carried cost. This time there was no obvious hero choice. This time there was only decision. A long silence paused over the room again. The kind that doesn't fear hesitation. The kind that respects it. Leadership discussed. Measured. Challenged. Returned to the table. Finally, the convoy adjusted. Not full retreat. Not reckless push. A tempered middle. More spacing. Adjusted timing. Defense posture adapted. Eyes sharper. Breath slower. They entered the uncertain stretch, as prepared as preparation allows humans to be. And sometimes that is all you get. The next problem didn't arrive as gunfire. It arrived as mechanics, and whether ganging up the way they sometimes do when the world decides to complicate lives. A vehicle issue mid-stretch. Not catastrophic, but enough to matter. Enough to slow the entire body down. Enough to change timing in a place where timing wasn't supposed to change. Radios tightened again. Instructions sharpened. The pace of breathing in the room subtly changed. Mara watched the map with that painful kind of attention, focus fueled by worry and steadied by refusal to let fear dictate decisions. One wrong delay in the wrong place could reshape everything. And the weather wasn't helping anymore. It was leaning in. Visibility dipped again. Wind pushed sound sideways. Terrain forced angles no one liked. A fragile moment was building. She spoke the update quietly. Clear. Precise. Not dramatic. Then inside her, the thing she hadn't said out loud yet, the thing she'd been carrying under calm professionalism, finally pressed hard enough that silence no longer felt like strength. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't make it emotional. But the weight in her tone changed. She told the colonel what she believed. They were crossing the threshold where control begins to erode, where competence can no longer bully nature into behaving, where risk stops being manageable and starts becoming opportunistic. Waiting too long to pivot is often worse than pivoting too early. He listened, really listened, not as a superior, as someone who understood that expertise is something as sacred as rank. Orders shifted. Layers of protection increased. Backup contingencies activated early instead of too late. Support channels widened and warmed, ready to catch if the world decided to drop weight on them. Outside, in machinery and weather and human hearts beating in armored vehicles, that mattered. Inside, Mara felt something strange. Fear was still there, but something steadier wrapped around it. Connection. Responsibility shared instead of silently carried. She wasn't the invisible admin anymore. She wasn't the quiet voice ignored until crisis proved it shouldn't be. She was part of the spine of this place now. And that terrified her. Because when people trust you, failure stops being a private wound. It becomes communal. She swallowed that thought, focused back on the map, anchored herself in purpose. Minutes stretched like hours. Updates rolled in imperfect but intact. Adjustments responded to adjustments. The convoy moved like a heart beating against pressure. For a while it held. Then, something else shifted. Not weather. Not machines. The human element. A split-second misjudgment somewhere ahead. A hesitation. A correction too sharp. Momentum rebelling against intention. A near incident forming. Breath ripped the air from the operations room again. Voices rose on the radios, not panicked, but strained, urgent, too close to tipping. The kind of moment where history hangs in fractions of movement. Mara leaned toward the console instinctively, not to control, but to witness with absolute clarity so she could guide if guide became possible. Her heart pounded. Her face stayed calm. And deep inside, buried beneath professionalism and restraint, a truth whispered that scared her more than anything on the screens. She wasn't just trying to protect them anymore. She needed them to make it. Not for duty, for something far more human. Because after carrying so much loss in silence for so long, she wasn't sure she could carry another failure and stay whole. Hope pulsed painfully through fear. Leadership steadied. Instructions clarified. Hands on wheels steadied. The near disaster slipped away by inches. Not victory. Not yet. Just survival again. Fragile. Uncertain. Unfinished. The convoy continued, but now the room understood what she had felt all along. They were no longer inside a mission that simply needed to be executed. They were inside a moment life could turn sharply without warning. And everyone could feel how close it was to choosing a direction. What happens when the line finally starts to tremble, and everyone realizes that calm has limits? The convoy held its shape after the near incident, but something subtle had cracked. It wasn't panic. Panic is loud. This was quieter, a tightening, a shift in tone, the kind of tension that doesn't scream, it lingers, coils, waits. Voices on the radio still sounded professional, but there was a different gravity inside them now. Even courage has a pulse, and sometimes you can hear it. In the operations room, no one said it out loud. They just felt it. That fragile space where competence keeps winning, but not easily anymore. Mara stayed anchored to the screen. Her eyes didn't blink as often now. Her shoulders had shifted slightly forward without her noticing, like her body was leaning toward the danger even though she was nowhere near it. It wasn't heroism. It was connection. Those moving dots weren't icons anymore. They were people breathing inside machines. And they were trusting her. That truth settled deeper than anything else. Weather pressed harder now. Not catastrophic, not cinematic, just difficult. The kind of difficulty that stacks itself layer by layer until one more inch feels unbearable. Visibility dipped and rose like someone was dimming the world slowly to see who would notice. Wind dragged interference across comms like static breathing. Terrain forced the convoy into a longer, more controlled descent along a stretch Mara had never liked. Not because it was obviously deadly, because it was quietly unforgiving, steep enough to demand attention, narrow enough to dislike mistakes, curved enough to turn hesitation into hazard. She stared at it for too long. Once upon a time, she might have convinced herself she was overreacting. Now she understood her instincts better. She asked for additional telemetry, requested real-time traction reports, checked spacing again. Someone at a console murmured, "It's within tolerances." She didn't argue. She didn't need to. Her silence carried its own weight now. The colonel stepped closer, not looming, standing beside responsibility instead of above it. He didn't ask for reassurance. He asked for reality. She gave it to him. The descent would test them, not catastrophically, just relentlessly. The danger wasn't a single dramatic event. It was fatigue, conditions slowly asking people to be perfect for too long. And humans aren't perfect. He nodded, adjustments rolled out, spacing increased again, support positioned smarter. The convoy adapted like a body learning to breathe under new pressure. For a while it worked. Then something small went wrong. It always starts small. A slip in traction. A correction slightly too wide. A shift in formation timing. Nothing disastrous. Just enough to pull every heart in the room upward into their throats. Voices tightened again. Instructions sharpened. The vehicle recovered. Relief didn't arrive as celebration. It arrived as silence. But the silence wasn't comfort. It was exhaustion fighting not to become fear. She listened to the radio like she could feel the driver's shoulders tightening. She could tell who was forcing calm, who was breathing carefully, who had started speaking half a second slower because brain and nerves were fighting for space. Weather thickened more. The descent continued. And somewhere beneath all of it, the ghosts inside Mara woke louder. She flashed back for half a breath to another night. Different terrain, different situation, same feeling in her chest. That slow awareness when a moment tilts closer to loss than safety and you can't force it back straight with willpower alone. Back then she had been inside the fight. Inside the noise. Inside the losses. Now she was on the outside, armed only with maps, instinct, and a quiet voice people had finally learned to trust. Both were terrifying in their own way. She caught herself pressing her palm flat on the console, like she was trying to physically steady the world. No one commented. No one laughed. No one would dare now. Minutes stretched again. People moved well. Leadership led well. Soldiers held the line. Machines obeyed as best as machines ever do. Then a second problem appeared. Not mechanical. Not weather. Human vulnerability. One of the drivers reported dizziness. Just a fragment. Just a few words. Just enough to introduce a new kind of danger. Fatigue and weather are a cruel pair. The room reacted, calls exchanged, protocols activated, a shift planned, a controlled swap to keep the convoy safe. Sensible, necessary. But timing mattered. Terrain still narrowed. Descent still demanded precision. The wrong pause in the wrong place could invite disaster. Mara's throat felt dry. She didn't speak immediately. She calculated, measured. Then she recommended a point, not the easiest, not the earliest, but the safest window the land would allow. A breathing space carved inside pressure. The room listened, not because she sounded sure, because she refused to sound careless. The swap began. Machines slowed. People coordinated. The world held its breath again. Then the radio cracked with something no one wanted to hear. An unexpected shift. A slip. A moment where weight and momentum chose their own laws instead of obeying orders. It wasn't catastrophic. It was on the edge. A heartbeat from tipping into something everyone in that room would carry forever. Voices collided. Hands reacted. Training took control where fear wanted to. The vehicle steadied. Barely. Silence swallowed the operations center like water. Someone ran a hand over their face. Someone exhaled in pieces. Someone else muttered something that sounded like prayer disguised as profanity. Mara remained still. Outside, no one knew her heart was shaking this hard. Inside, she locked it down because emotion wasn't allowed to guide right now. But it hurt. It hurt how close that had been. It hurt how human these people were. It hurt how unforgiving the world could be even when everyone tries their absolute best. And into that fragile quiet, something else arrived. Another update. This time not mechanical. Not weather. Not fatigue. Movement. Unmapped. Uncertain. Potentially hostile. Not a confirmed threat, but enough to shift every equation. Risk layered on risk now. Pressure deepened. The colonel's jaw tightened. The room sharpened. Gravity returned like a physical presence. And inside Mara, the thing she'd been carrying since the beginning of this operation finally reached its breaking point. Not breakdown. Not panic. Truth. She realized she didn't just want them to get through this mission. She needed them to. Because after everything she'd carried, after the silence, after the medals that didn't heal anything, after the guilt that never fully left, after being invisible for so long and then finally trusted again. She didn't know if she could survive watching another group slide out of safety, while she stood here powerless to physically step in. The fear wasn't logical, and it wasn't supposed to be. It was human, but she didn't let it take her voice. She steadied herself and spoke clearly into the rising tension. Her tone changed, not louder, not commanding, just deeper, more anchored, as if she had finally stopped trying to sound calm and simply sounded honest. She told them the truth of the moment. They were at the limit. They were inside a zone where risk was no longer theoretical. The convoy was balancing between endurance and fate. Another misstep or pressure applied at the wrong second could reshape everything. Not to scare them, to respect reality. The colonel met her eyes. There was something in his gaze now that hadn't been there weeks ago. Not authority, understanding, responsibility shared instead of placed. He asked the question leadership asks when courage shifts from pride to burden. What do we do? The room quieted around them. Screens glowed. Radios crackled like distant thunder. Every decision they had already made hung in the air like held breath. They were still in motion, still committed, still alive. But the world had tightened its hold around them. And the next choice was going to matter more than any map had suggested at the beginning of this mission. Outside, engines rumbled through weather. Inside, a woman who once carried papers unnoticed now carried something far heavier. The fragile beating heart of possibility. And somewhere deep inside, beneath professionalism and restraint, beneath scars and memory, a quiet voice inside her whispered a question she didn't dare say out loud. What if this time, even your best isn't enough? What do you tell yourself when every calculation has been made, every precaution has been taken, and uncertainty still refuses to loosen its grip? The room didn't move the way it had earlier. Back then, tension was a visitor. Now it felt like it had decided to stay. People spoke quieter, but their silence was louder. Radios breathed like uneasy lungs. Screens pulsed like waiting heartbeats. The convoy continued, disciplined, controlled, but control was no longer confidence. It was endurance. The colonel's question still hung in the air. What do we do? There are questions that aren't requests for orders. They are invitations into shared responsibility. They acknowledge the weight without pretending it is light. They admit leadership isn't magic. It's choosing with full knowledge of consequence. Mara didn't answer immediately. It wasn't hesitation. It wasn't doubt. It was respect for the moment, for the lives, for the truth that there was no perfect answer, only honest ones. She leaned in toward the map and did what she always did. She looked at the land like it wasn't just geography. She looked at the convoy like it wasn't just position icons. She listened to the wind inside the radio static. She listened to the breath inside the voices. And then quietly she spoke. They needed to slow the rhythm of risk. They needed to buy calm before calm was taken from them. They needed to create breathing room artificially, deliberately, before circumstances closed it entirely. Her proposal wasn't dramatic. It wasn't heroic. It was painfully human. Shift posture defensively. Create space. Allow the convoy a controlled moment to reset mechanically, mentally, physically. Then move with intention, not momentum. It wasn't tactical brilliance. It was compassion stitched into strategy. And for a second, the room wasn't an operations center. It was a place where people remembered that strength isn't speed, control isn't dominance, and safety doesn't always mean forward. Sometimes courage is allowing yourself to pause. Leadership absorbed it, turned it over, challenged it, protected it. Then the colonel nodded. Orders moved. Outside, machines slowed, not abruptly, respectfully. The convoy shifted into a shape that allowed protection from potential movement in the distance, stability against weather, room for breath that mattered more than momentum. If you'd never been in a moment like that, it wouldn't look dramatic at all. Just vehicles adjusting, just people pausing, just the world exhaling slightly around them. But to those living inside it, it was everything. Inside the operations room, that fragile silence returned, this time without sharp edges. It was still tense, still uncertain, but steadier, stronger, more honest. For a few minutes, nothing happened, which is what everyone desperately needed. Then the situation began to evolve. The weather stabilized slightly. Visibility lifted slightly. Movement detected earlier shifted direction and distance, not gone, but no longer pressing against their timeline. Risk didn't vanish. It softened. And sometimes that is enough to move again, without feeling like the ground is choosing for you. Another round of planning, another shared breath, another quiet recalibration of courage. The convoy resumed, slower, smarter, with a new layer of caution that didn't feel like fear anymore. It felt like respect. They finished the descent. Not perfectly, not gracefully, but intact. Reality didn't reward them with triumph. It offered something better. Continuity. Progress without tragedy. Life without headlines. The tension in the room didn't snap free in celebration. It released in pieces, through breath, through small nods, through eyes that blinked harder than usual. People didn't cheer. People rarely do after the moments that really matter. They just existed for a few seconds in the quiet miracle of, we're still here. Updates flowed smoother after that. The route ahead simplified. Fatigue eased. Confidence returned, not cocky, just steady. Hours later, the convoy cleared the most dangerous part of the mission. Not safe forever, just safe enough. The operations room didn't erupt. Heads lowered, shoulders relaxed. People who had seemed carved out of tension softened into humanity again. Mara didn't collapse. She didn't cry. She didn't celebrate. She just let go a little. Only enough to feel her hands shaking. Only enough to acknowledge how deeply she'd been holding on. The colonel didn't clap her on the back or make a speech. He simply stood closer for a moment, not as a commander, as a witness. "Good work," he said quietly. 2 simple words. But inside them lived 1,000 things he didn't need to say. Trust, respect, gratitude, shared relief. Later, after the final updates rolled in and the room dissolved back into normal activity, people approached Mara the way people approach something sacred and fragile at the same time. Some spoke, some didn't. One simply touched her arm gently, then walked away. Human language fails sometimes, and silence does its best. She stayed for the full debrief, helped build the record of what happened, what nearly happened, what mattered most. The document wasn't written like victory. It wasn't written like failure avoided by miracle. It was written like truth. A hard mission. A dangerous environment. A set of decisions made with caution and courage, instead of ego and denial. Later, when she finally stepped outside, the air felt different, not because the base had changed, but because she had. She wasn't carrying invisible weight anymore. She wasn't fighting to be heard. She wasn't pretending risk didn't hurt. She had been needed. She had been trusted. She had held. That doesn't heal everything, but it helps wounds stop feeling like they own you. In the days that followed, life didn't transform into something dramatic. Bases don't become inspirational posters after near tragedies. They become slightly quieter, slightly wiser, slightly more willing to listen to the right voices. People didn't treat Mara like a myth. They treated her like someone whose quiet mattered, which is all she had ever wanted. The metal stayed beneath her bracelet again. Not hidden, protected. When someone asked, very gently, if she ever thought about speaking publicly about what she'd done across her career, she shook her head, not dismissively, just firmly. Some stories don't belong to audiences. They belong to the hearts that survived them. Time moved forward. One morning she walked the same hallway where laughter once followed her, where impatience once brushed her aside, where assumptions once made her small. Boots, radios, coffee, movement. The world looked the same. But it was. Someone stepped aside without being asked. Someone nodded with quiet respect. Someone murmured her name like it mattered now. She didn't slow. She didn't bask in it. She didn't need to. She carried papers again. Only now, everyone knew they were just papers. They were lives, decisions, weight, and she carried that like she always had. With dignity, with steadiness, with the aching, beautiful truth that real strength rarely shouts. She paused once near a window, letting the outside light hit the bracelet on her wrist. For a brief second, the metal beneath it reflected not for show, not for praise, just for her. A small reminder. You survived. You stayed. You acted. You mattered. She breathed in. Let the air fill places fear once lived. Let the quiet settle where guilt used to echo. Then she kept walking. Because purpose doesn't always look like glory. Sometimes it looks like paperwork carried by steady hands. Maps studied by tired eyes. Decisions made by a heart that refuses to abandon people to uncertainty. And somewhere deep inside, the part she rarely showed anyone, a softer truth settled into place. Sometimes redemption doesn't arrive as forgiveness. It arrives as trust. Sometimes honor isn't loud. It walks quietly beside you. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.